When Solene Brooks walked through the doors of that immaculate prenatal clinic, she was carrying the one secret that could unravel everything she had spent 6 months carefully building. The divorce was final. The signature was dry on the page. She had vanished from Haneul Park's world so completely that even his most seasoned men couldn't find a single trace of her. She had become a ghost, deliberately, methodically, and out of pure survival instinct. But some truths refused to stay buried beneath paperwork and distance. The moment Haneul's shadow stretched across that gleaming corridor floor, the careful life she had constructed around herself, around her child, cracked along every invisible seam. Because Haneul Park was not the kind of man who accepted conclusions others wrote for him. He was the kind of man who rewrote the ending entirely. He had been looking. She just hadn't known how hard. And now, standing 5 feet away from the woman he had let walk out of his penthouse, his marriage, and what little remained of his conscience, he saw the one thing that stopped the most feared crime boss in Seoul's underworld dead in his tracks. She was pregnant. Some men let go. Haneul Park never learned how. Before we go any further into this story, if you love intense, emotional tales of dangerous men and the women bold enough to walk away from them, smash that like button right now and subscribe to Mafia Moonlight Tales so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below with your city. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. And if someone in your life needs to hear this tonight, hit that share button and send it to them. Now, let's get into it. Haneul Park was not a man who made mistakes. At 34, he had built the Park Syndicate from the fractured ruins of his late father's street-level operation into one of the most sophisticated organized crime networks on the eastern seaboard. He did not raise his voice. He did not repeat himself. And he did not, under any circumstances, lose something he had decided to keep. Which was exactly why the sight of Solene Brooks, visibly, unmistakably, enormously pregnant, on the other side of a hospital corridor in a city she was never supposed to be in, shattered the composure of a man who had stared down loaded weapons without blinking. But we will get to that moment. First, understand who these two people are, and how a woman intelligent enough to disappear from a ghost ended up in the same building as him. The Unseo Women's Health Pavilion was the kind of medical facility that didn't advertise. Its name appeared nowhere on a public directory. You found it the way you found all truly exclusive things in this city, through a referral whispered at the right dinner party, a number passed on a business card with no logo. Situated on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in Midtown that housed a law firm, a private equity group, and a members-only social club, it was a clinic designed for women who required absolute discretion. The elevator required a keycard. The front desk staff were bound by NDAs more airtight than most federal witness protection agreements. The waiting room held 6 chairs, always arranged in a deliberate semicircle, upholstered in the kind of dove-gray fabric that whispered money without screaming it. Solene Brooks did not belong here. That was exactly why she had chosen it. She stepped off the elevator at 10:47 in the morning, moving slowly, not because she was unsure of herself, but because 8 months of pregnancy had renegotiated the terms of every movement her body made. Her camel wool coat hung open at the front, northwest longer able to close across the full, round swell of her belly. Beneath it, a fitted cream knit dress clung to every curve of a body that had stopped being entirely hers sometime around the 4th month. She had learned to make peace with that. More or less. The receptionist, a woman in her late 40s with the serene, sculpted face of someone who had seen everything and retained nothing that wasn't her business, looked up with a practiced half-smile. "Good morning. Name for the appointment." "Brooks," Solene said, sliding her ID across the marble desk with a steady hand. Solene Brooks. Not Park. Never Park again. She had returned to her maiden name the same afternoon the divorce was finalized, sitting alone in the offices of a midtown attorney she had found herself, paid for herself, and instructed not to share her new contact information with anyone. Not his lawyers. Not his assistant. Not his mother, who had never fully looked her in the eye anyway. No one. The receptionist handed the ID back with a nod and gestured toward the waiting area. Solene moved to a chair near the window, lowering herself into it with the measured care of someone who had learned that gravity was no longer a neutral party, and rested one hand instinctively on the curve of her abdomen. She did this constantly now, this unconscious, proprietary gesture. Her palm against the drum-taut surface of her belly, as if to remind herself and anyone watching that whatever was inside belonged to her. Only her. Solene Brooks was 31 years old. Before the marriage, before the park name and the armored cars and the penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home, she had been a graduate student in international art history at Columbia, supplementing her fellowship income by consulting for a small Brooklyn gallery that specialized in West African contemporary work. She had been sharp, self-possessed, and absolutely certain she could recognize danger when she saw it. She had been wrong about that last part. Haneul Park had walked into that gallery on a Thursday evening in November, 17 months before she signed the divorce papers, wearing a black overcoat and an expression that suggested he found approximately 90% of human interaction beneath him. He had not been there for the art. He had been there because the gallery's owner owed his organization a debt, and Haneul had come personally to restructure the terms. He had not expected to find a woman standing in front of a 6-foot canvas of Kent-patterned abstraction, speaking in quiet, fluent French to a collector, completely unbothered by the tension his presence usually injected into any room. He had stood there for 4 minutes watching her before she noticed him. She had not flinched. That, apparently, was the beginning of everything. Their courtship, if it could even be called that, moved at the velocity of a man who was accustomed to identifying what he wanted and removing all obstacles between himself and the acquiring of it. Within 6 weeks, he knew the name of every professor she'd had at Columbia. Within 3 months, he had proposed over a dinner she hadn't agreed to attend until he appeared at her apartment door with reservations she couldn't refuse and an honesty she hadn't expected. "I am not a good man. But I have never wanted anything the way I want your time." That has to mean something. She had told herself it did. What she had not understood then, what took her 2 full years inside that marriage to comprehend, was that wanting something and knowing how to hold it gently were 2 entirely different skills, and Haneul Park had only ever mastered the first one. Haneul J1 Park. 34 years old. 6'1". The kind of physically imposing that had nothing to do with bulk and everything to do with stillness, the coiled, deliberate stillness of a man who had learned in early childhood that silence was a more effective weapon than volume. His black hair was always immaculately styled, swept back from a face that could have belonged to a surgeon or a senator if the neck and knuckle tattoos hadn't told a different story entirely. A sprawling garden of black ink roses climbed from his collarbone to the curve of his jaw on the left side, a design chosen not for aesthetics but for meaning, every bloom representing a name, a debt paid, a line crossed in the name of the organization that had consumed 3 generations of Park men. He wore bespoke suits the way other men wore armor. He was fluent in 4 languages, held a degree from Yonsei University in economics that he had completed in 3 years, and had restructured the Park Syndicate's finances so thoroughly in his first 2 years as its head that their legitimate real estate holdings now outturned their underground operations 3-1. Interpol had a file on him. So did the FBI. Neither had been able to get anything to stick. His men called him Iamak, the ice boss, behind his back and sometimes, with careful reverence, to his face. He had never corrected them. What none of them had ever seen, what Solene alone had witnessed in the small, unguarded hours between midnight and dawn when the armor came off, was the men underneath the syndicate. The men who kept a single photograph of his mother on his desk and touched the frame sometimes when he thought no one was watching. The men who had, on exactly one occasion, cried in her presence, silent, rigid, controlled even in grief, the night his closest lieutenant was killed. The men who had whispered, 3 weeks before she left him, "I don't know how to be what you need. Tell me how." She had believed he meant it. She had also believed that meaning something and being capable of it were the same thing. They were not. The nurse appeared at the waiting room entrance, clipboard in hand. "Ms. Brooks. We're ready for you." Solene rose carefully, smoothing her coat, and followed the woman down a corridor lined with muted abstract prints, the kind of art chosen specifically to be beautiful and say nothing. The examination room at the end of the hall was bathed in soft, clinical light, painted in a shade of warm ivory that was meant to feel less sterile than it actually was. She had been coming here for 2 months. Same routine. Vitals, measurements, the Doppler pressed to her belly and the sound, God, that sound, the rapid, steady drumbeat of a heartbeat that had nothing to do with fear or ambition or crime family politics. Just a heartbeat. Pure and insistent and entirely hers to protect. "Everything is looking excellent," Dr. Yoon said, reviewing her chart with the efficient warmth of a woman who clearly loved her work. "Baby's measuring right on schedule. Head is down. Heart rate is strong and regular." She looked up. "Any concerns since your last visit?" 1,000. "No," Solene said. "Everything's fine." It was what she always said. It was what she had to believe. She was doing this. She was doing this alone, which was terrifying and clarifying in equal measure. She had a remote consulting job with an arts organization that asked no questions about her location as long as the work arrived on time. She had a quiet apartment in a neighborhood where the bodega owner knew her name and the neighbors kept to themselves. She had a hospital bag half-packed under her bed and a birth plan she had written and revised 4 times. She had not told anyone who the father was. She had not told anyone she was even still in this city. She had been so careful. She accepted the follow-up appointment card from the nurse, tucked it into her purse, and began making her way back down the corridor toward the elevator. Her lower back ached in the persistent, grinding way it had for the past 3 weeks. The pregnancy books called it normal, her body called it relentless. She moved slowly, one hand pressed to the small of her back, eyes on the elevator doors at the end of the hall. She was thinking about the appointment. About the drive home. About whether she had defrosted the soup she'd made on Sunday. She was not thinking about him. She had trained herself, deliberately and painfully, to stop thinking about him. She had been largely successful. And then the back of her neck went cold. It happened before she saw anything, before logic or reason could catch up with instinct. A deep, cellular recognition. The particular quality of stillness that entered a room when Haneul Park was in it. She had felt it 100 times over the course of their marriage. She had told herself she would never feel it again. Her steps slowed. Her hand, still cradling the side of her belly, tightened involuntarily. She looked up. He was standing at the far end of the corridor. Black suit. No tie. The roses climbing his neck. Both hands still at his sides, which was how she knew he was as stunned as she was, because Haneul Park always had one hand in his pocket and one hand ready. Still hands meant the architecture of his control had just taken a critical hit. His eyes moved from her face. Down. And stopped. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It felt like a geological event. Solene Brooks had spent 6 months outrunning this moment. She had changed her number, altered her routine, chosen a clinic in a building that had no public record of its medical tenant. She had been meticulous. She had been invisible. And Haneul Park was standing 10 feet away from her, staring at the evidence of everything she'd kept from him, with an expression she had never once seen on his face in the entire length of their marriage. He looked afraid. Not of her. Not of what this meant for his empire or his rivals or his carefully managed public life. Afraid of her leaving. Again. Right now. Before he could say a single word. His mouth opened. Solene's hand pressed harder against her stomach. Don't, she said quietly. One word. The whole history of them compressed into a single syllable. He didn't move. Neither did she. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Down the hall, a phone rang at the reception desk. Somewhere behind a closed door, a machine beeped its steady, indifferent rhythm. The most powerful crime boss on the eastern seaboard and the woman who had walked away from everything he offered stood in a hospital corridor and looked at each other across a silence 6 months wide. And everything was about to change. The penthouse had 42 windows and not a single curtain that fully closed. Haneul had designed it that way deliberately. A man with nothing to hide, the architecture announced, has no need for darkness. Solene had learned, in the 18 months she lived inside those walls, that this was the most elegant lie she had ever been asked to inhabit. She had understood something was wrong on the night of the Park Syndicate's annual dinner. 11 months into the marriage. A private event held in a restaurant that had been emptied and rented entirely for the occasion, 43 guests seated at a single long table the color of black lacquer. She had worn the dress Haneul selected, deep burgundy silk, fitted, appropriate, and sat in the chair to his left as she always did, speaking when spoken to and smiling in the calibrated, pleasant way she had slowly, without fully noticing, learned to perform. Midway through the 3rd course, one of Haneul's lieutenants, a man named Dasik, who had never once addressed her directly in 11 months, leaned past 2 people to speak to Haneul in Korean. Solene's Korean was intermediate at best, assembled quietly over the course of the marriage from a textbook she kept in her studio and the fragments of conversation she absorbed like sediment. She caught perhaps 60% of what was said in any given exchange. That night, she caught enough. Dasik had referred to her as Jangshigam. A decoration. A piece placed on a surface to signal taste and ownership and nothing further. Haneul had not corrected him. He had replied with 2 words, "Algo isio, I know," and returned his attention to his food. The table continued its conversation. Someone laughed. A server refilled her water glass. Solene set her fork down slowly, aligning it with the edge of her plate with the precise, controlled care of a woman who understood that the version of herself allowed to react to what she had just heard did not exist at this table. Would not be permitted to exist at this table. She picked the fork back up. She finished the course. But something had calcified inside her chest in that moment, quiet, irreversible, the way a fracture in deep ice is invisible until the thaw reveals it has been there the whole time. She did not leave that night. Or the next month. Or the 4 months after that. She told herself she was being careful, strategic, that she needed time and resources and a plan that Haneul could not anticipate. All of that was true. But the more honest truth, the one she admitted to herself only in the exhausted hour before sleep, was that leaving a man like Haneul Park required more courage than she had fully assembled yet. She spent 6 months assembling it. Then she walked out on a Tuesday morning while he was in a meeting, carrying 1 bag and her entire life in a direction he never predicted she'd go. She had not looked back. She had told herself she never would. She was still telling herself that when she looked up in that hospital corridor and saw him standing 10 feet away, staring at her like a man who had swallowed something he couldn't name. He found her 3 days after the hospital. She had known he would. That was the thing about having been married to Haneul Park. You stopped being surprised by his reach and started being surprised only by its speed. She had changed her number, her name on the lease, her entire daily routine. It had taken him 72 hours. He knocked. He didn't pound, didn't send someone ahead to announce him. Just 3 measured knocks, the same unhurried rhythm he used for everything, as if the world would wait because it understood it had no real choice. Solene looked through the peephole. Black coat. Both hands visible. He knew she was looking. He was giving her the deliberate courtesy of appearing unthreatening, which was perhaps the most Haneul thing he had ever done. She opened the door but not the chain. Through the 2-inch gap, they regarded each other. He looked, she thought, like a man who had not slept. The sharpness was still there, it was architectural in him, built into the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders, but underneath it something had shifted. He seemed, improbably, uncertain. Solene. Her name in his mouth still landed differently than it did anywhere else. She had always hated that about herself. "You have 30 seconds, she said. "Then I close this door and call the attorney who has a restraining order already drafted and sitting on her desk." Something moved across his expression. Not offense. Closer to pain, which was almost worse. "I'm not here to take you back." "Then what are you here for?" He was quiet for a moment. When Haneul was quiet, most people filled the silence out of anxiety. Solene had learned to outlast him. "There is a property," he said finally. "Riverside. 12 rooms, full medical staff access, private security on the perimeter. Discreet. Safe." A pause. "For the baby." Solene looked at him for a long moment. At the ink roses climbing his neck. At the gold watch he wore on the wrist of the hand that was now pressed flat against her doorframe, not to push it open, just resting there, as if he needed something to hold on to. 12 rooms, she repeated. 11 more than you need. "I'm aware." "Haneul." She said his name the way she used to in their worst arguments, not with cruelty, but with a terrible, exhausted clarity. "You cannot buy your way into this. Not with a house. Not with security teams. Not with anything that has a price tag, because what I need from you has never been something you can purchase." He said nothing. "Go home," she said quietly. "Talk to a lawyer. We'll figure out co-parenting like 2 adults." She began to close the door. "Don't come back without an appointment." The chain caught. The door held. On the other side of it, she heard him exhale, slow, controlled, the sound of a man swallowing something enormous. Then his footsteps. Moving away. She stood with her back against the door for a long time, one hand pressed to her chest, feeling her own heartbeat prove she was still standing. The first time she noticed the car, she told herself it was a coincidence. A dark gray sedan, parked across the street from her building 2 mornings in a row. No plates she could read from her window. No one visibly inside, though the tinted glass made certainty impossible. She had stood at her kitchen window with her tea going cold in her hand and talked herself out of it methodically. This was a residential street, people parked, cars sat idle. She was 8 months pregnant and sleep-deprived, and her nervous system no longer understood the difference between a genuine threat and an ordinary Tuesday. She almost believed herself. Then she saw the same sedan outside the pharmacy on Thursday. 3 blocks from her apartment, in a direction she hadn't planned to walk until that morning, a decision made on impulse because she needed antacids and the closer drugstore was out of the brand that actually worked. The car was parked at the corner. The engine was running. Solene bought her antacids. She walked home a different way. She counted her breaths to keep her pace even and her face neutral, because she had spent enough time inside Haneul's world to know that panic was information you did not give freely to people watching you. That evening she called his number. She had told herself she would not be the one to call first. She called anyway. He picked up before the second ring. The sedan, she said without greeting. Gray. Tinted. It's been on me for at least 4 days. Is it yours? A silence that told her everything. Haneul's silences were a language she still spoke fluently. This one was the specific quality of a man recalibrating quickly. No, he said. Flat and certain. It's not mine. The bottom of her stomach dropped. She heard him already moving, footsteps, a door, the muffled exchange of Korean with someone nearby. His voice when it returned was controlled in the way that meant the opposite underneath. Solene. Where are you right now? My apartment. Lock the door. Don't go near the windows. A pause so brief it was barely a breath. I need you to listen to me very carefully. Don't. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Don't give me orders. Just tell me what's happening. Another pause. This one cost him something. There are people, he said slowly, who have been waiting for a vulnerability. Something they could use against me that I couldn't predict or prepare for. His voice dropped a register. They've known about the pregnancy longer than I have. The tea she'd made an hour ago sat untouched on the counter. The sonogram photo from her last appointment was pinned to the refrigerator, a small, blurry profile, one tiny fist raised as if in protest. Solene stared at it. So she's a target, she said quietly. Before she's even born. Haneul did not insult her by saying she was wrong. He came with 2 of his men and posted them outside her door without asking. She let it go. Under the circumstances, the argument wasn't worth the energy, and she was running low on both. What she hadn't expected was for him to stay. Not in the commanding way he used to occupy space, filling a room with the gravitational pull of someone accustomed to being its center. He stayed quietly, settling into her small kitchen chair like a man who understood he had no authority here and was trying, visibly, to make peace with that. He had removed his coat. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, the tattoos continuing down his forearms in dense, intricate black, roses and Korean script and something that looked, in the low lamplight, like a child's handwriting rendered permanent in ink. Solene sat across from him with a glass of water she wasn't drinking, and because the silence had lasted long enough and her curiosity had always been stronger than her pride, she said, "Tell me what they mean." He looked up. "The tattoos," she said. "You never told me. In 2 years, I never asked." A pause. "I'm asking now." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding how much of himself to hand over. Then he turned his left forearm toward her and touched the lowest rose, the one closest to his wrist. The smallest one. The oldest, she could tell, the ink slightly softer with age. "My mother," he said. "She died when I was 9. This was the first one. I was 17. He moved upward along his arm. "Each one after is someone I lost inside the organization. Men who served under my father. Who served under me." His voice was even, practiced in the recitation, but his eyes, she noticed, stayed fixed on the ink rather than her face. It began as grief. Then it became a count. "How many?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer. Which was its own answer. Her gaze moved to his neck, to the elaborate garden climbing toward his jaw. "And those?" Something shifted. Almost imperceptible. My father's design. He had it drawn before I was old enough to choose. Said a parkman should carry the family's weight visibly. A muscle moved in his jaw. So no one would ever mistake what we were. Solene absorbed this. The boy at 17, needling grief into his own skin. The child before that, inheriting a man's burdens before he'd grown into his own name. You've been trying to control things, she said slowly, since before you understood that was what you were doing. He looked at her then. Really looked, the way he rarely permitted himself. Yes, he said. Simply. Without defense. Outside her door, his men stood watch in the hallway. Inside, for the first time in longer than either of them could measure, something between them breathed. She gave herself 2 days to think about it. Alone, which was the only way she had ever made decisions that she could fully trust. The problem was not the security. Intellectually, she had already accepted that the gray sedan had changed the calculus, that the version of herself who could manage this pregnancy in quiet, self-sufficient isolation had been replaced, without her consent, by a version who had a target on her back and needed to be honest about what that meant for the child she was carrying. She could hold her pride and her principles simultaneously. What she could not do, in good conscience, was hold them above her daughter's safety. The problem was what accepting Haneul's protection would cost her. Not in money. In precedent. In the slow, incremental way that allowing a man like Haneul Park 1 inch of re-entry had a way of becoming something considerably larger if she didn't draw the architecture of it herself, precisely and in advance. So she called him on the morning of the second day. I'll accept the detail, she said when he picked up. 2 people. Not 6. 2, who I approve by name, who report any security concerns to you and any logistical conflicts to me. My space, my schedule, my rules inside this apartment. Agreed. No hesitation. She had expected negotiation and got none, which made her momentarily suspicious before she continued. There's a condition. A beat. Tell me. Co-parenting therapy. A professional of my choosing, weekly sessions, both of us present. She kept her voice even, clinical almost, because the ask felt enormous and she refused to let him hear that. We are going to share a child, Haneul. That means we need to learn how to be in a room together without the power dynamics of our marriage running the conversation. I need to know you can do that before I agree to any arrangement that puts you consistently in my orbit. The silence this time was longer than usual. She waited, watching a pigeon navigate her windowsill with the determined, unhurried confidence of something that had never once questioned its right to be exactly where it was. You think I can't do it, he said finally. Not an accusation. More like a man identifying a fact about himself he hadn't fully examined yet. I think you've never been asked to sit across from anyone who had equal authority in the room, she said. I think that's going to be uncomfortable. And I think you'll do it anyway, because the alternative is doing this the wrong way, and somewhere underneath everything you already know what the wrong way cost us. Another silence. Shorter this time. Send me the therapist's information, he said. Solene exhaled, slowly, through her nose, where he couldn't hear it. I'll send it tonight, she said, and ended the call. Outside her window the pigeon lifted off, unhurried, into a sky that was just beginning to clear. The therapy sessions had been happening for 2 weeks. Solene would not have called them successful, exactly. Progress in that room looked less like breakthrough and more like excavation, slow, gritty, the careful removal of one layer at a time. Haneul sat across from Dr. Anand with the contained posture of a man who had agreed to be there and was honoring that agreement through sheer force of will. He did not deflect. He did not perform. He answered questions with the same sparse precision he applied to everything, and occasionally something true surfaced in the space between his words that made Solene look at the floor to give him the privacy of not being watched while it happened. It was progress. She kept that assessment to herself. They had fallen into a quiet rhythm after the Thursday sessions, walking to her apartment together since it was on the route and the security detail was present anyway. Not talking much. Existing alongside each other in the specific, careful way of 2 people relearning the basic grammar of shared space. It was on one of those evenings, standing in her kitchen while she heated soup and he stood at the counter doing something on his phone, that it happened. She felt at first, a rolling, insistent movement just beneath her ribs, stronger than usual, the baby shifting with the sudden purposeful energy she sometimes displayed in the evenings. Solene set down the spoon and pressed her hand to her side on instinct. "She's moving," she said. Not an invitation. Just information, spoken aloud the way she sometimes narrated things to process them. Haneul looked up from his phone. She hadn't planned what came next. It arrived as an impulse, rising from somewhere beneath strategy or caution or the careful architecture of the terms she'd set between them. "Do you want to feel it?" He went very still. "You don't have to," she added. "Yes," he said. Immediately, the way he'd agreed to therapy, before the thinking could interrupt the wanting. He crossed the kitchen and she took his hand, larger than she remembered, and pressed it flat against the right side of her belly where the movement was concentrated. His palm was warm. She kept her hand over his for a moment to position it, then let go. 3 seconds. 4. Then the baby moved again, a distinct, rolling push against his hand, deliberate as a greeting. Haneul's breath left him. She watched it happen. Watched the precise, assembled composure of Haneul Park come entirely undone in the span of a single breath. His jaw shifted. His eyes, fixed on her belly, went soft in a way she had seen only once before, the night his lieutenant died, in the dark, when he'd thought she was asleep. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice had lost every hard edge it carried. "I don't want to miss this," he said. "Any of it." A pause. "I don't want to be my father." Solene said nothing. Sometimes the most honest response was simply to let a man hear what he'd just admitted out loud. The storm had been building since afternoon, the kind that arrived in October with the weight of a verdict, turning the sky the particular bruised green that preceded something serious. By 9 o'clock the rain was horizontal against her windows and the thunder arrived not as rumble but as concussion, shaking the glass in its frames. Haneul was still there. He had stayed after dinner without being asked and without asking permission, reviewing something on his laptop at her kitchen table while she sat on the couch reading, and they had existed in that fragile, functional proximity that had been slowly becoming their new normal. She heard his phone vibrate. Then again. Then his chair scraped back. The look on his face when he crossed the room toward her was one she recognized from the 2 years she'd spent learning his expressions against her will, the absolute, locked-down calm of a man receiving information that required him to feel nothing until later. "We need to move," he said quietly. "Now." She was already setting down her book. Something in his voice had reached past every argument and every wall she'd built and touched the animal part of her brain that understood danger before language did. "How long do we have?" "Minutes. Maybe less." He was already at her closet, pulling her coat from the hanger, bringing it to her, not holding it open in command but offering it, waiting. "There's a service exit through the basement. My car is on the east side." "The stairs," she said. "I can't move fast on the stairs, Haneul." "Not right now." "I know." He said it without frustration, without the tactical impatience she had expected. "We go at your pace. My men hold the floor until we're clear." She put the coat on. He didn't rush her. They moved into the stairwell, her hand on the rail, his hand hovering 2 inches from the small of her back, present without touching, ready without controlling. The fluorescent lighting stuttered once, twice. Outside, the storm detonated another thunderclap that reverberated through the concrete walls like something structural shifting. 4 floors. She took them steadily, breathing through the pressure in her hips, and he matched her, step for step, shortening a stride built for speed to one built for her. Above them she heard his men in the corridor, the clipped exchange of Korean, a sound she had once found menacing and now recognized as the specific frequency of people protecting something they'd been ordered to keep alive. At the basement door he paused, checked his phone, checked the door. His hand settled briefly at her back, solid, grounding. "Clear," he said. They moved into the dark and the rain together. He angled his body between her and the open lot, taking the exposure she couldn't afford. She noticed. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They were 4 blocks from the hospital when the contractions started. She had told herself it was the running, the cold, the adrenaline, her body processing the threat the only way a body 33 weeks along knew how. She had pressed her hand to her side and breathed and said nothing because they were almost clear and saying it out loud would make it real and she needed it to not be real yet. Then the second one came, 6 minutes after the first, and she made a sound she couldn't suppress. Haneul turned from the window immediately. Solene. It might be early labor, she said. Each word precise and separate, the way she spoke when she was managing something enormous. I need you to call the hospital. Dr. Yoon. Tell her 33 weeks, contractions 6 minutes apart, possible stress trigger. He already had his phone out. Outside the SUV, the rain hammered the roof and somewhere behind them his men were running an intercept on the 2 vehicles that had tracked them from her building. The gunfire, when it came, was brief and distant, muffled by weather and reinforced glass, but it was there. She felt him register it and choose, without visible deliberation, to keep his eyes on her. He made the call. His voice was steady in a way she recognized as constructed rather than felt, built from the same composure that had carried him through 100 crises, now entirely redirected toward a different kind of emergency. Stay on the line, Dr. Yoon's voice came through the speaker. Get her here as fast as you safely can. Solene, I need you to breathe through the contraction, slow in, slow out. Don't fight it. Another one was already building. Solene felt it crest and closed her eyes, breathing the way she'd practiced in the prenatal classes she'd attended alone, sitting in a circle of partnered women and quietly preparing herself for exactly this aloneness. She had not imagined it would look like this. Haneul put his hand over hers. Not instructing. Not directing. Just present, the solid weight of him anchoring her to the seat, to the moment, to something outside the contracting tunnel of pain and fear. Look at me, he said quietly. She opened her eyes. You are the strongest person I have ever been in proximity to, he said. And I have known some formidable people. Something moved in his expression, raw and unmanaged, the face beneath the face. She is going to be fine. You are going to be fine. I need you to believe that for the next 8 minutes. Outside, his world was at war. Inside, he had reduced his entire existence to 8 minutes and the sound of her breathing. The hospital entrance materialized through the rain-blurred windshield. The car hadn't fully stopped when his door opened. He was already coming around to her side. She was born at 4:17 in the morning, 7 weeks early and absolutely furious about it. 4 pounds, 9 ounces. A full head of dark hair, Solene's nose, and a cry so fierce and immediate that the delivery room nurse laughed, not professionally, but genuinely, the startled laugh of someone caught off guard by the sheer audacity of a new person announcing herself. Dr. Yoon placed her on Solene's chest and Solene stopped being aware of anything else in the world. She had a name already. Had carried it quietly for months, chosen alone in her apartment on a night when the city was unusually still. Ji-yeon Adiz. A name that held both of them, both worlds, both bloods, both histories, without belonging entirely to either. Haneul had been in the waiting room. Hospital policy, the hour, the controlled chaos of an early delivery, there were a dozen reasons. The real reason was that Solene had needed that room to be hers alone, and for the first time, he had understood the difference between a boundary and a rejection. A nurse brought him in after. Solene watched him cross the room and she watched the exact moment he saw his daughter, small and blanketed and impossibly real against her chest, and she understood that whatever Haneul Park had been before this moment was permanently behind him. Not erased. Behind. The way a city looks different after you've seen the ocean for the first time. She held Ji-yeon out without speaking. He took her with both hands, carefully, the way he had held nothing before in his entire adult life. He sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at her face for a long time without saying anything. When he finally spoke, it was barely above a breath. She has your mouth. She has your temperament, Solene said. She came out arguing. Something close to a smile crossed his face. Real and unguarded, the rarest thing he owned. 3 days later, from a chair in that same hospital room while Solene slept and Ji-yeon lay in the bassinet between them breathing her small, determined breaths, Haneul made 2 phone calls. The first was to his legal team, instructing them to begin the formal restructuring of the Park Syndicate's remaining street operations, dissolution of the contracts, transition of territory, a clean and final withdrawal from the work that had built the family name on a foundation he no longer wanted his daughter to inherit. The second was to Dasik, his longest-serving lieutenant. That call was shorter. Dasik had expected it eventually. he said only, "Understood, boss." Then a pause. "What do we call you now?" Haneul looked at Ji-yeon. At the rise and fall of her chest. At the absolute authority of something so small simply by virtue of existing. "Call me her father," he said. "That's enough." 6 weeks after Ji-yeon came home, Haneul learned to swaddle. It took him 4 attempts, 2 quiet consultations with a YouTube tutorial he would never admit to watching, and 1 moment of such concentrated, furrowed focus that Solene had to turn away to hide the fact that she was smiling. On the 5th try, the blanket held. Ji-yeon stared up at him from the tightened fold with the ancient, unimpressed expression of a newborn who had already formed opinions. "She's judging me," he said. "She has good instincts," Solene said. "She gets that from me." He looked up. The corner of his mouth moved. Obviously. This was how it went now. Quietly. Imperfectly. 1 swaddle, 1 feeding, 1 3 a.m. walk around the apartment at a time, Haneul moving in slow circles with Ji-yeon against his chest, speaking to her in low Korean, his voice stripped of every register of authority it had spent decades constructing. Just a man. Just his daughter. Just the dark and the particular hush of a city resting. Solene watched him sometimes from the doorway and thought about cycles. About the way damage traveled, not randomly, but along the lines of inheritance, passed from hand to hand like an heirloom nobody chose and nobody knew how to refuse. Haneul's father had given him control because control was all he'd had to give. His father before that, something harder still. Each generation armoring the next against a world that had hurt them, not understanding that the armor itself became the wound. The cycle broke when someone chose to feel the fear instead of fortifying against it. When a man sat in a therapist's office and answered questions he'd spent his life deflecting. When he shortened his stride on a staircase. When he put his phone down and kept his eyes on the woman in front of him while his world burned outside the window. It broke, too, when a woman learned that asking for help was not the same as surrendering herself. That interdependence and independence were not opposites but a conversation, one that required 2 people willing to keep showing up to the table even when the table felt impossible. True protection, Solene had come to understand, was never the sedan outside her building or the men at her door or the bulletproof glass between her and danger. Those things addressed the symptom. Trust addressed the source. A child raised inside walls was safe. A child raised inside trust was free. Ji-yeon deserved to be free. So did they. Haneul set the baby gently in her bassinet and straightened, rolling his neck the way he did when something had cost him physically. He looked at Solene across the small, lamplit room. No negotiation in his eyes. No management. Just a man looking at the person who had required him to become someone worth looking at. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For not letting me stay who I was." Solene held his gaze. "Thank yourself," she said. "You're the one who changed."